All right. Hello, and welcome to the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. I am your host, Aaron Farmer. Today, we are joined by Yella Hewings-Martin, PhD. So Yella holds a biochemistry BSc Bachelor of Science, that's what I want to say, from King's College London, and a PhD in pediatrics and child health from University College London. Prior to joining Medical News Today, which is the blog where she writes, and she is a kind of a research editor, she worked for many years in research, developing new treatments and diagnostics for severe skin injuries and skin cancer. She is particularly interested in how researchers communicate the impact of their findings to the general public, which is something we are definitely going to touch on today. But the reason why she's on the podcast today is because I found probably an older article that she wrote looking at the role of sugar in cancer. And now, longtime listeners of this podcast know that is something that I'm very interested in. And so here's someone who has actually done quite a bit of research on cancer, who is familiar with particularly, the previous ideas of cancer, that it is almost solely a genetic disease, and has maybe seen some of the thinking on this change a little bit over the last couple of years. So I wanted to get her on, pick her brain. She also has quite a bit to say about the role of sugar in mental health, and just the role of science in the public as well. And we're going to do our very best to get to all of that. Those are all very deep subjects. So Dr. Yella, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
So I guess first question is Yella. Is that a family name? Here in Texas, we call someone Yella. It means they're a coward. So I hopefully that's not what it means for you. Where'd you get that name?
So Yella is actually a short version of the name Gabriella, and it comes from northern Germany. And it's originally spelled with a J, but my parents, in 1980 just decided to change it from a J to a Y, because why not? And so it was Yella. So no relation to being a coward.
Yeah, that's definitely a Texan word. Okay, well, that's good. So let's get into a little bit of your research. I gave kind of the high points of what you're all about, but how did you decide that you wanted to be a research scientist, and then how did you decide you wanted to look at cancer specifically?
Yeah, so I think I've always been interested in what makes the body work. And when I did my first degree, I was very interested in genetics, and I really thought I was going to be a geneticist. And then the more I learned about genetics, I realized that you can find a gene that's involved in a disease, but it still doesn't give you any understanding of what causes that disease. So you're really then looking at the biochemistry or the cell biology of what, that gene that makes a protein, what that actually does. So when I went to do my PhD, I worked on a rare children's disease, and the gene had been identified, but what that protein actually did, nobody knew. In fact, still nobody knows now, but it was quite an interesting area of cell biology. And I then went into research looking at really how to regenerate skin. So this is when people have quite severe skin injuries. You can use skin grafts and other kind of artificial therapies, but another way of doing it is by growing somebody's own skin cells in the lab and then putting them back on. And that's what we did. And then as a sort of adjunct of working with skin, we started looking at skin cancer. And we are looking specifically at melanoma, which is not the most common skin cancer, but it's the most deadly skin cancer. We have a relatively high rate here in the UK, partly because people don't have very good sun-safe behavior, and, other areas in the world have kind of, similar experiences. And our role really was to look at diagnostics. We were really interested in what drives that cancer, but our active research was in how to use different molecules in the blood to diagnose different stages of that skin cancer. So, my interest has been sort of ongoing from then. And because of a change in the institute that I was working in, I then decided to go into kind of research publication and medical news. And in many ways, when you're a scientist working in a lab, you always have this idea that you're going to change millions of people's lives, and you're going to affect a lot of people. When you're writing news, and when you're writing about science, and when you're analyzing, studies that other people have done, you're maybe not in many ways actively changing so many people's lives, but I think you're still contributing to a general understanding of what goes on in research, what people can trust, where they maybe have to be a little bit critical. So that's kind of my passion now. So I've come a long way from learning about science, doing a lot of science, and now I try and get other people to understand the science that people do in labs and in clinics around the world.
So one aspect of your story is very common to some of the people that we have on this podcast, which is they are studying a disease, and you can pick almost any disease out of a hat. It could be Alzheimer's, it could be cancer, it could be type 2 diabetes, it could be anything, any of these long-term chronic diseases that seem to plague us over the years. And the story I get over and over and over again is we started studying the genetics, and we found many genetic markers that made someone more susceptible to a certain disease, like ApoE4, and you know, there's a ton of them out there that make people susceptible to certain diseases. But time and time again, what we find is that the genetic markers don't seem to play too big of a role in whether or not somebody actually gets a disease. It may make them more susceptible to do it, but the genetics alone don't seem to be the smoking gun that determines whether or not somebody gets the disease. It is almost always some epigenetic factor: sun exposure, diet, level of exercise, exposure to toxins. It's almost always these other epigenetic factors that seem to be the key role in whether or not somebody actually starts, displaying symptoms of the disease. Have you found that to be true? And have you seen any new research that's maybe, newer to us in the last decade or so that seems to support that conclusion?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And you're right. So, unless you have a disease that's definitely a genetic disease that's caused by a single mutation, and there are some, like cystic fibrosis, where people know pretty much what happens. I think the rest of the diseases, you're right. There's lots and lots of studies that will identify a risk factor and a risk gene. And cumulatively, you get this sort of, map of maybe highlighting somebody's risk, a certain percentage. I think what we now know is that genetics is actually a lot more complicated, and our cells are a lot more complicated than we thought even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, and certainly 15 or 20 years ago. So when you're talking about epigenetics, you're talking about things that change how our genes are regulated and what our cells do with these genes that we sometimes inherit from our parents, or that can be changed by the outside environment. And that's a really big factor. So, when I first did my undergraduate degree, when I went to college, we were only just touching on that. And now there's so much research that's really pinpointing, individual bits of regulation that we didn't even know existed. So, for example, when we're looking at melanoma, there's some very well-known mutations that are implicated in quite advanced stages of melanoma skin cancer. And then we're looking at lots and lots of other genetic factors that can regulate these genes. So there are now stretches in our genetic code that we thought were what's called junk DNA, so DNA that doesn't do anything. And there are actually lots and lots of very small regulatory molecules in there that can then affect whether a gene is active or not. Now, we didn't know about these until the turn of the century, and there is so many of them, and each one can affect quite a lot of different genes, so we still don't really understand how a lot of them work. So we're looking at, these other factors, and then we're looking at the influence of, as you said, diet, environment. And I think for a long time, again, people thought, well, if you eat too much of something that's bad for you, it's going to somehow affect, your organs. But now I think we understand that even at the cellular level, these things have an effect. So, for example, before people try to conceive babies, the amount of, say, things like painkillers they take or the kind of food that they eat will leave essentially a genetic mark that they can pass on to their offspring, even if that's well before a baby is conceived. So we now know that our diet, our environment has a really long-range effect, even if we don't quite understand how that works, but we know these things have an effect for a long, long time, which unfortunately makes the whole thing so much more complicated, and makes it more complicated to really determine somebody's risk of a disease, and also more complicated to treat.
All right, so you broke up just a little bit there. I wanted to make sure that I understood there at the end about about how things were about how epigenetic factors were working on, I guess, through this junk DNA to affect, the real, genetic expression of a disease?
Yeah, so for a long time we thought...
Can you hear me? Okay.
For a long time we thought that there are lots and lots of bits of our DNA code that doesn't do anything. And now we know that there are actually lots of little bits that don't necessarily have a function in the cell in terms of, normally genes make proteins that do something in the cell. These things don't make proteins, but they regulate other genes. And that we didn't know 15 years ago. So all of a sudden we had a whole nother complex layer of regulation in the cell. So you may not have a particular genetic mutation that officially predisposes you to, say, heart disease, but you might have these other regulatory factors that we didn't know about before, which may contribute to your risk or reduce your risk. And all of a sudden we're finding these patterns, that make it much more complicated, which is harder to understand, but I think at the end of the day, we'll get a deeper understanding, just that our models become much, much more complicated.
Much more complex. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we're finding is that we've kind of put ourselves into a modern world with modern issues, and we don't really, we still have a Paleolithic body, basically. We're basically just, monkeys that fell out of a tree, and we're in this new modern world. We don't really understand everything that the environment is doing to us. So let's talk about some dietary issues, because that's kind of what I'm interested in. So sticking with your specialty of skin cancer, have you seen, and I want to talk about sugar here in a minute, but have you seen a role of increased polyunsaturated fats, seed oils, vegetable oil, corn oil? Have you seen that these new fats that have been introduced into our diet over the last 100 years or so, have you seen an effect of these new fats on things like skin cancer?
I think with skin cancer, really the major risk factor is sunlight exposure. So that's a type of cancer where we really know the risk factors quite well. And by staying out of the sun, certainly with melanoma, you can really avoid getting it. But I think in many, many other areas of cancer, where the cells themselves, aren't going to be so exposed to UV, and they may be more involved in the kind of the body's metabolic processes, we're certainly seeing much more of a link to diet than we did before.
Right. Well, I can tell you from personal experience, since I've switched over to a diet that's high in saturated fat, I do not sunburn. It's pretty amazing. I can spend all day out in the sun, and I do not sunburn anymore. It's been pretty amazing. So, the other thing that actually that I actually found you with online was the role of cancer, or the role of sugar in cancer. So let's discuss this a little bit. What is it that, I guess the first question is, do you think increased consumption of sugar can drive higher rates of cancer?
I think there is certainly enough evidence now that links the two. There is not so much evidence that links them directly. So okay. I think the official answer at the moment seems to be that increased sugar consumption drives weight, and that contributes to obesity. And obesity itself is a very high risk factor for developing cancer. I think there is a good chance that we will find more specific direct connections, over time. But I think, that's where we are with the studies that, are very, that have been large, that are reproducible, that, that have a sort of high trust. So that's probably what happens. You eat too much sugar, you become overweight, and then the other metabolic problems that you have with obesity then drive cancer progression. We know that both insulin and IGF-1 are growth hormones and hormones that stimulate cell division. Have you seen any evidence that these two hormones are implicated in cancer growth and the spread throughout the body? Yeah, so certainly with insulin, there's some quite good evidence that, if you're obese and you have higher levels of insulin and the other kind of problems that come with that is linked to a higher risk factor of cancer. What actually happens on a cellular level is a little bit disputed, and different people have different theories. But I think that's probably something that we can pretty much take at face value now, even if we don't know the minute details so much. With other growth factors, there are other hormones in general. So, for example, if you look at the role of estrogen in breast cancer in women. So normally the estrogen is made in the pancreas, but our fat cells can also make estrogen. So if you have too many fat cells, which you have when you're overweight and obese, these cells themselves can then produce those hormones, and those hormones are linked to breast cancer. So there is a definite link there, even if we don't understand the exact mechanisms 100%.
Yeah. What about other hormones? Are there other hormones that seem to stimulate greater cancer growth?
Well, I think probably if you're looking at the whole host of growth factors, but again, I think there's quite a lot of areas of research that are somewhat in its infancy. So I think there's a lot that we don't know yet.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And we seem to, because we seem to be really kind of be at the forefront of a new type of, especially cancer research, because just like you said, we didn't really understand epigenetic factors, until less than 20 years ago. And so these newer ideas seem to be kind of on the forefront of cancer research. We talked a little bit off camera about Dr. Thomas C Freud's work, and because I'm, full disclosure, I'm totally fascinated with his work. I think it's stunning, the things that he's done. One of the things that he has said, and that I think has at least enough validity that we need to look at it and understand it, is one of the things that's going on with a cancer cell is, before there was enough plant life on the earth to have enough oxygen that we could have cells that could respirate. Cells, life got its first little blocks of ATP from fermentation. And so his theory is that what a cancer cell does is is a cell that has fallen down the evolutionary ladder, so to speak, and reverted to its most primal form. It has lost the ability to respirate oxygen, and it can only get its energy from fermentation, from fermenting sugar. First of all, are you familiar with that theory? And second of all, what is your opinion of it? Do you think it has any validity?
So I'm a little bit familiar with it. I think it's really interesting, and I think what is really difficult is how to study these things, because
right.
When you study cancer, you obviously can't look inside the body of a person with cancer. So often people will use cancer models. So these are either cells grown in a petri dish in a lab, and that's what many people use because it's reproducible. You can do it. It's relatively straightforward. We might use a number of model animals that you can induce cancer into, but a mouse is not a person, and a cell in a lab also isn't a person. So I think even if somebody has very good evidence from those model systems that's very convincing, I think it's always important to take a step back and look at the fact that to translate those findings into a human is always going to be a little bit difficult. I think what is interesting when you look at a cancer cell, it obviously works on quite a different level to a non-cancerous cell. So as you said, the cancer cell will generate energy, which all cells need to live and do their normal function, and they will generate that in a slightly different way. So it will go back to fermenting sugar, which a normal cell doesn't really do, because it generates energy in a different way, in a different compartment in the cell called a mitochondria, which some people call the powerhouse of the cell. But actually there is some evidence that cancer cells can make use of both pathways, and sugar fermentation itself also isn't particularly efficient. So again, nobody really knows why cancer cells do this, and there is some evidence that some of the the mitochondrial energy pathway is mutated and not functioning, and then other people say that it isn't, and cancer cells use both. So I think it's a little bit disputed, but I think it's really interesting to look at cancer in a way that doesn't just say you have a mutation in one gene, then you have a mutation in another gene, and then you straight away have cancer. It's more complicated. Cells are very, very complicated. They're very good at repairing themselves. And also cells mutate all the time. We're exposed to things that damage our cells all the time, and we have ways of getting rid of those cells. So, these processes are complicated, and cells themselves are hugely complex. And I think it's really interesting to look at the cell as a more holistic entity and look at different pathways that can go wrong and that do go wrong in cancer. And certainly there's lots and lots of evidence that cancers have a higher rate of sugar consumption because they ferment sugars for energy, even if they also get energy through other mechanisms.
So you've also written about at least one new type of cancer treatment that exploits this weakness that cancer has to sugar, where scientists are using a very specific type of sugar to target cancer cells specifically. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, so this is a sugar called mannose 6-phosphate, or just mannose, and by changing basically the way that the cell, or the type of sugar that a cell uses, you can get it to react in a very different way. So you can push it down a different path. So you can slow down its metabolism, you can slow down its rate of cell division, its rate of cell growth, so that, if you can stop cancer cells from multiplying, you can essentially slow down tumor growth. You can, hopefully shrink a tumor if you can kill cells that way. So this is a really promising area of research, and this team who worked on this, have got some very, very interesting evidence, but again, not in humans yet. So clinical studies would be to follow, obviously under supervision, so they themselves kind of caveat that you shouldn't, as a person with cancer, all of a sudden, kind of start eating a different type of sugar to kind of try and self-medicate. But I think it's really interesting way of looking at cancer is to use cancer's own metabolism to beat it,
So would the idea here be to piggyback some type of drug on the mannose and to get it into a cancer cell, or just starve it of glucose by using the mannose?
Yeah, so you can do different things. So you can starve it of glucose by giving it a different sugar, but there's evidence that if you then combine it with some other of the chemotherapy reagents, that you can actually then, kind of hit it with the two-pronged approach. So you slow down its metabolism and you also kill it in a different way. And I think probably as with many cancers, it will be a combination of different therapies, of different approaches, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to kill all the cells to really get rid of what's there.
Okay, that's fascinating. So one other thing that you that I wanted to talk to you about was the role of sugar consumption on mental health. So you've written about this extensively on your blog. So can you give us kind of a primer on the role of sugar in mental health, and what are the things that we need to know about that?
Yeah, so there is really mounting evidence linking sugar consumption or consumption of, processed foods that are high in sugar with mental health issues. And that's a whole gamut of mental health issues, which in some ways is not surprising if we look at, how sugar is metabolized, how all our food is metabolized, and the fact that our microbiome plays a big role in metabolizing all our food. We now know that the bacteria in our gut are intricately linked to our brain and what happens there. So, as with all things, an association does not mean cause and effects, but there's a clear link there that, quite a lot of studies support now. The exact mechanism isn't known, but I think that's really worth mentioning that, obviously sugar adds to weight, and you could then postulate that maybe weight has an impact on mental health. But I think even bypassing weight, sugar and how it's metabolized and what happens to our body and our gut microbiome itself has a really big influence on mental health.
So Dr. Perlmutter has hypothesized that a lot of, and he's not the only one, there's many, that a lot of what is driving depression and these poor mental health outcomes that we're seeing that are growing in prevalence in the public is the sugar, of course, but the main thing is that it's the inflammation from eating grains and these other processed foods. Have you seen any evidence to implicate inflammation specifically?
Well, I think I think it's really difficult to really pinpoint those links. So again, weight and obesity is highly linked to inflammation. So that probably again is the root that people will be looking at to look at that connection. So what happens when you eat too much sugar, and then so the insulin levels go up, inflammation goes up, and that will then drive a whole host of other processes.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it speaks to really a big problem that we have, is that everything is so interconnected. It's very difficult to drill down on one thing and the mechanism by which one thing is causing problem X leads to problem Y, because we're so interconnected. But the one thing that does seem to be clear, and hopefully you would agree with this, is that by getting out especially refined sugar, processed foods, processed grains, polyunsaturated fats, foods that come in a box, in a bag, and things that have been introduced into our diet over the last 100 years or so. If we remove these types of foods, there seems to be a system-wide benefit that affects pretty much everything that we can find. Is that
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly lots and lots of evidence that points in that direction. I mean, refined sugar really in many ways does not have to have any place in our diet. So our bodies don't need it to function. It really is there, only because we like it, and because it's been introduced by the sugar industry, right. For us to like it. But we don't need it. But also, of course, the body doesn't really differentiate in terms of sugar between different sources of sugar. So even people who try to look for sugar alternatives, whether it's in the form of honey or other things, if it's the same molecule, your
right.
body will treat it the same way. As for the processed foods, again, I agree. And if we look at, studies that look at how processed food interacts with our microbiome, so our gut bacteria, they don't do very good things for us. There's so much evidence now that links a Western diet to a reduction in the diversity of our gut microbiome. So we may still have the same amount of bacteria there, but we haven't got the spread. And that, that drives problems with weight, problems with mental health, so many problems. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot of evidence now pointing to really all this food that we've grown so used to, and that's been marketed to us as being so convenient and so tasty, really doesn't have any place in our diet, and certainly doesn't have any place in large quantities in our health.
Exactly. So you mentioned the sugar industry. So there's one last topic that I wanted to kind of approach with you, because you're someone who I think is uniquely positioned to speak to this. There was a new study that came out just in the last couple of days. So this was a study that was, first of all, funded by the sugar industry. So, I mean, it's going to have its issues. But it was looking at the rate of kidney disease in agricultural workers that worked in sugar fields. So these were sugar field workers who were exposed, doing a lot of manual labor. They were in heat. They didn't drink hardly any water because the water supply in these areas were questionable at best. So they were drinking a lot of sugar sweetened drinks to hydrate themselves. and that there is a very high rate of kidney damage, of kidney disease in these populations. So the sugar industry did a study to figure out what was the issues, and of course, the conclusion that they reached was whatever it is that's causing these kidney problems, we don't exactly know what they are, but we're pretty sure it's not the sugar. It's one of these other issues. So, first of all, I think the conclusions of the study are biased, to say the least. What is it that we as the public need to know about these scientific studies that they come out? What is it that we need to be looking at? How seriously should we be taking, any given scientific study that comes out and hits the airwaves? There was one just a couple days ago that looked at the role of a high-fat diet, and it talked about all of this damage that a high-fat diet did, and then when you break it apart and look at it, the fat was soybean oil. No, who's eating a diet that's 40% soybean oil? So what is it that we need to know as the public? How can we be better educated members of the public when it comes to reading these scientific headlines? And we never get the study. We always get the headline in the USA Today, or in your local newspaper, and it takes work to look and find out what these things actually say. So can you kind of walk us through what we need to know?
Yeah, I think, that's really, I think, a really good summary of what I think a really big problem is for websites like mine, and for the general public, and maybe for all our health in general. So there are different ways that, as a reader of news, you can look at the quality of the content that you're getting. So one thing to look at is which scientific journal is this study published in? But
that's
again,
because that's one of the things I say is that if a study comes out through Harvard, take it with a grain of salt, because apparently Harvard has a hard time coming out with unbiased studies. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you. Go ahead.
Well, and so I think, but even so, one of the most well-known journals in all areas of scientific research is the journal called Nature. And they, if you have a publication in Nature, that's, as a scientist, your career is probably set for life. But there are papers published in Nature that have to be retracted, because even though they've gone through peer review, so this is when other researchers not linked to the study actually look at it, they come back with questions, highlight any problems. Even though things have been peer reviewed, sometimes other people say, well, we've tried to replicate your findings and we can't, and then people have to retract their studies.
Right.
This is a big problem, but even more so, when you're reading your daily news, you don't really want to then go on the journal's website, read a 30-page article that's full of, probably quite complicated, maybe stats, methods that you're maybe not familiar with. So really, I think as science journalists, we have a really big responsibility to look at the sources, to make sure that when we report on studies, we really look at, what's being reported. We highlight the quality of the research. And that's sometimes possible and sometimes it isn't possible, because many science news articles are written without the reader being able to actually read that primary study paper, which is a problem. So we're kind of all relying on everybody involved to reporting that data correctly. So the scientist, the journal really has to trust the scientist to write up a paper on results that say they've actually done, not something they've made up. And the peer reviewer, the other scientist, also has a big role, and they obviously also, have to disclose if they have any conflicts of interest. The journal then has to look at it. It then is published. There might be a press release from the institution or from the journal. So again, these people have a responsibility, then the news outlets have a responsibility. But again, more and more, as consumers of health news, I think we're taking things into our own hands. We're not just reading things and trusting everything anymore. We're asking questions. We are following up those links that we should find in a decent, news article to the primary sources, and we're asking questions. But it really comes down to, I think, as a consumer of news, to take everything with a pinch of salt. And scientists are very, very critical of themselves and of other scientists. So just because somebody is a professor somewhere does not mean that as a scientist I have to believe what they've published, or I have to believe in their ideas, or I have to believe in their conclusions. And I think that's a really healthy process in research. We're always asking questions of ourselves, of our own research, and of others, and we're allowed to be critical, as is, I think, everybody around the world. You know, you don't have to believe what you read. You have to really form your own opinions based on how credible you as an individual think what you're seeing is. And that's good. I think that really empowers people. In terms of funding, that's really complicated, you know. Now, this study that you mentioned, and that's really, you know, that's a big research effort, people looking at the link between, you know, agricultural conditions and kidney failure. And there's different people working on this, and different people have come to different conclusions. And, you know, the study that we've talked about a little bit, the sugar industry gave the money to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. So, and they have said officially that the funder does not have any editorial or, you know, planning or any impact on how the study is done. Now, as a researcher, you're always scrounging around for money because, you know, all research is very expensive. And, you know, if somebody comes along and goes, oh, here's a big check because we really believe what you're doing is a good thing, you're very unlikely to turn it down, because at the end of the day, you know, you need to have somebody to give you a paycheck. Right. And you know, you need that for your career. But it is complicated because there are often, you know, different layers of complexity between where the funding comes from, and you know, this is the same with funding that comes from the pharmaceutical industry, you know. But theoretically, there should be a clear distinction between where the money comes from and then complete independence to publish what you find. The other thing to say, though, is that, you know, when you publish a paper and you come to a very strong conclusion that you know, can have a really big impact on a lot of people's lives, I think you need to be really sure that what you're publishing is true. So if you see an association that is very weak, again, I think as a researcher, you know, you have a responsibility not to blow up your findings and say, oh, we found a link, and that's very interesting. That must be very significant. You know, I think you have to put it into the context of the statistical significance. You know, and then there's the issue of reproducibility, and that's, you know, no two studies are the same, so it's very difficult to compare them. But I think, you know, it is very difficult to know what to trust. But I think if you find industry funding for a study, it's very good to question what you see, and you know, and I think that's very good. I think we should all be doing that. That doesn't mean that everybody who directly or indirectly receives that kind of funding is swayed by whoever their funder is. But it's really worth digging into it and being very, very critical.
Yeah, and you know, you would think that that there would be part and parcel of every study a certain amount of the funding set aside for someone else to, you know, to debunk it. I really think that's part of what you should do. If you have a study, if you're going to give $1 million or whatever to study one thing, then you know, 750,000 of it goes to the people that are initially doing the work, and then the other 250,000 goes to somebody to debunk it, and at least see if they can replicate the findings, or, you know, or something. Because I think if there was more oversight, if there was more accountability, if somebody knew that no matter what study that they put out, that somebody was going to look at it and determine whether or not that if their findings could be replicated, there would be a lot less junk science coming out. Because right now, nobody's looking. You know, if a study comes out, it's just accepted at face value. You know, at worst, it, you know, goes viral and everybody reads about it in the newspaper. At best, it's ignored. But no one is trying to take it to task, or at least a very, very small percentage of the findings that are being published are being taken to task. And it is interesting. And I think publications, you know, well, like yours, and like, you know, the journalists, you know, the journalist, field in general, I think a lot of times that the headlines that they write are specifically tailored to drive clicks, which I understand the business model of that. But sometimes it's hard. The general public, they read a headline, eating sugar gives you superpowers or something. They're not going to dig through 30 paragraphs to find out if that's true. And I don't fully know what the solution is or what it would be. I just know that there's a real problem here with members of the public like me, not being able to fully trust what we read in the paper, what we read coming out of our most prestigious colleges, nutrition schools, and it's difficult to track down. But I think the real problem is that we tend to not trust anything. I mean, like I know this is something that I've really had to fight against, because I was told for so long, if you want to eat less, you just gotta, or if you want to lose weight, you got to eat less, you got to move more, you got to, that's the key. Be afraid of saturated fat. Don't worry, eat 10 to 13 helpings of whole grains per day, and that's going to be the healthiest way to eat. And as I discovered that pretty much everything I had ever been taught about nutrition was wrong, I tend to find every scientific study that goes against my new mindset and treat it with a degree of caution that might be unwarranted. And I know a lot of people are kind of in that same boat, and I don't know what the solution is. Can you think of anything that we could do as the public to try to? I mean, I know you just went through a lot of things, but is there an easy fix?
Unfortunately, I think that, like with all things in health, for example, there is no easy fix. But I do think that there is a trend now to being more critical, and I think you give a really good example from your own personal experience. You are now critical. Now, 10 years ago, you might have taken what you would have read at face value, and all scientists are critical of each other. So I think that's a brilliant mindset to have, because our findings change, our understanding of science changes, and we have to adapt. But obviously, clinical guidelines and sort of national and international nutrition guidelines, they have to be very clear-cut, because it gets very confusing otherwise. But, even these guidelines change, and they have to be adaptable based on new findings. But I think to get to the heart of your question, so as an individual, I think every person should be critical enough to find those sources of information that they feel are credible. Right? And with health news, I think it's important to obviously look at, the credentials of the people who are putting out the news. So are they writing it themselves, or are they just, republishing things from somewhere else, for example? And if you look at how articles are written, are people, say, linking to the sources? So if you're citing statistics, can people back up the statistics that they're citing? Do they have slightly more critical articles where people look at a study, but then maybe have an entire section of we asked another researcher, they've commented on this, So I think these are all good things to look for. These are the things that I look for when I look for health news for myself, in those areas that I don't know that much about myself, But I think even then it's important to always look at, every piece of news is there in isolation, and you're not, in the, say, 800 words that we want to read quickly, you're not going to get somebody to write an entire essay about, say, the history of research in diabetes care, and this has changed, and this has changed, and this finding sits here within, this whole spectrum of different people's opinions. It's hard to get it in there. So I think, take it all with a pinch of salt, be critical and stay informed, because like you say, you are looking at new studies coming out. So you have your opinion, you see where it fits in, and you see it where it fits in with your own health, and then you can form your own opinion, And again, as time goes on and science moves on, that opinion might change, or you might refine it in certain aspects. And I think that happens with more and more information coming in. But unfortunately, there is no easy fix, but I do think that most scientists who do research into health, in their heart of hearts, mean really well. They want to make the people healthier, and they want to make the world a better place, and they want to cure diseases. It's just that sometimes their findings have been done maybe very much in isolation, and then 10 years later somebody comes along and says, now we know more about science, we're going to just have to say that wasn't true. Even though at the time it was to the best of their knowledge. In terms of headlines, though, I completely agree with you. Don't believe every headline. If you're going to read the article, really see whether the article backs up the headline, because sometimes they really don't.
Right, exactly. All right, well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Can you tell my listeners where they can, find what you're doing, what you're writing, where they can get in contact with you, find out more about you?
Yeah, so we're at medicalnewstoday.com. I write quite short articles now. I sometimes do sort of analysis articles about new findings, short articles where I answer people's questions. So if you have a question about your health, or a question about, science, how does something work, you can get in touch through our website, and I'm also on Twitter. So it's quite easy to find me and ask me questions, make comments, suggest article topics. So we're there, we're very passionate about people's health and their kind of journey through their own health. And we're there to support them, really.
Perfect. All right, guys, we're going to put links to all that in the show notes. You can find that at mysugarfreejourney.com/podcast. Yella, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, guys. And those of you that are listening, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.